by the Center for International Higher Education. Under the theme, Exposing the Fault Lines, Embracing Social Justice and in the Wake of a Crisis, we are having this webinar under the theme Black Lives Matter in a Global Context. I am Gerardo Blanco, and I serve as the Associate Director in the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. Before I welcome our panel, I just want to go through some housekeeping items. We ask you to keep your microphones muted. We also invite you to type your questions using the chat function. Feel free to type your questions throughout the whole session. There is no need to wait until the end. One of our research assistants is going to be collecting those questions and organizing them, and we will try to get to all of your questions in the order that they are presented. So as I said, feel free to pose those questions throughout, and it will be also very helpful because we are hoping to devote the majority of our time together addressing these questions, these comments, and these ideas that you may bring to both our invited panelists. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Crystal George Mwangi, who is Associate Professor of Higher Education, Research Affiliate in the Center for Student Success Research at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She is also a Chancellor's Leadership Fellow in the International Programs Office, IPO, at UMass Amherst. I am also delighted to welcome back Motun Bolumole, a recent graduate from the MA in International Higher Education at Boston College. Her thesis was titled Racism and the Well-Being of Black Students Studying Abroad. Both of our panelists contributed to a special section in our latest issue of International Higher Education, and I'll be sharing the link of this issue in case that you want to read their contributions. So the format for our session today is we will start with Dr. George Mwangi with some opening remarks, and then that will be followed by Motun's opening remarks as well. Each of them will have roughly 10 minutes, and immediately after, we will begin addressing all of your questions. So we look forward to having a very engaging conversation. So once again, welcome and thank you for joining us today. Dr. George Mwangi, please start.
Thank you for the introduction, and I'm happy and excited to be here. I will give fair warning that I have two little ones and have not been able to find a quiet space in my home today, so you might hear them a little bit in the background. But I wanted to start my remarks off with really centering the conversation around the Black Lives Matters movement and what it is, given the name of the session, before moving into some further additional details. So the movement was born in 2013 after George Zimmerman, who shot and killed an unarmed Black teenager, Trayvon Martin, was cleared of his murder. And at that time, a San Francisco-based organizer with the National Domestic Workers Alliance, Alicia Garza, responded to the jury's decision with a post on social media that she called a love letter to Black folks. And she ended that post saying, "We don't deserve to be killed with impunity. We need to love ourselves and fight for a world where Black lives matter. Black people, I love you, I love us, we matter, our lives matter." And her friend, Patrice Cullors, head of an advocacy organization for incarcerated people, repeated the line on her own social media accounts, but added the hashtag in front of Black Lives Matter. And together with Opal Tonetti, the director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, these three Black women began really getting the word out about Black Lives Matter and the hashtag Black Lives Matter and hashtag BLM were born, which ultimately led to the development of a movement first centered specifically on mobilizing mobilizing against police violence and later garnering an even broader agenda for Black liberation economically, legally, politically, via education, public health, and in so many other ways. And today, BLM reflects the issues of Black women and Black LGBTQ individuals, undocumented Black peoples with disabilities, etc. From the official website, it says that Black Lives Matter is an ideological and political intervention in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. It is an affirmation of Black folks' humanity, our contributions to society, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. And it's also a global movement with chapters and support all over the world. In my own work, I talk about anti-Blackness being a global and transnational phenomenon, and media, news media, social media has really heightened our accessibility in seeing the presence of anti-Blackness around the world in contemporary times. And in many ways has also provided greater accessibility to knowledge about the intentional anti-Black erasure that has historically impacted peoples within Africa and across the diaspora due to colonialism, transatlantic slavery, apartheid, Jim Crow, and other forms of racialized violence. Today, we're seeing protests in the US, as well as Nigeria, Brussels, England, South Korea, Australia, Brazil, calling to end police brutality and to defund the police in many spaces as well. Protesters worldwide are saying the name of George Floyd, but also Colin Kosa, Adama Traore, Belly Mujinga, Black men and women in other countries who have died in police custody in very suspicious ways, and that have not been fully investigated. And we're seeing statues of white supremacists fall in the US and South Africa and England. We're seeing Black college student movements here and in Brazil and the UK and other nations, with students, faculty, and staff talking about their experiences with racism. So, I see the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement as a vehicle for global mobilization and global and diasporic solution building for sure. And this is not a new approach to Black mobilization. So many Black activists that we've known throughout history have worked to build alliances with other people of color around the globe, linking the fight for civil rights with a vision of international human rights as well. So, that will bring me, I think, even closer back to my research and my final point around Black Lives Matter and migration. So both historical and contemporary, again, Black liberation movements have been fought by people, Black people, who have traveled from one country to another across Africa and the African diaspora. Some of the most well-known activists within the United States were immigrants, Stokely Carmichael, Marcus Garvey, or the children of immigrants, Shirley Chisholm, Audre Lorde, Opal Tometi, Malcolm X. Furthermore, many Black activists and leaders from around the world came to the United States for college as international students and later remained or went back to their countries of origin to fight anti-Blackness, coloniality, and white supremacy. This includes John Chilembwe, Claude McKay, Kwame Nkrumah, John Brown Russwurm. And even still, though, although anti-Blackness is a global phenomenon, it's also very contextual and local. And notions of Blackness shift as Black people of African descent migrate. I wrote this article for you all in international higher education called Black International Student Lives Matter, because it is also common for international students who are racially Black to first experience dissonance and uncertainty regarding the systemic racism present in US society, and more specifically, the US higher education environment. But this doesn't mean that racism isn't affecting them. It does negatively impact these students. They are still raced and racialized in the US. But because of the dissonance that the Black international and immigrant students can experience around race in the US, they may not initially feel connected to race and racism here, and may attempt to distance themselves from these issues or ignore them as a form of coping and survival. Yet, in my research, that I show that the institutionalized nature of racism and anti-Blackness within the US and embedded in higher education systems creates campus racial encounters and discrimination that often force students to consider their own racial identity and status in the US context. And research shows that over time, Black international students state experiencing more discrimination from US students and faculty than their white international student peers, including things like social isolation, exclusion from group work, being called racial slurs, racial microaggressions, being assumed as less academically prepared or intellectually capable, or other forms of harassment from people on campus, but also sometimes in their local college towns. So the racism and anti-Blackness that international students, though, experience is further intersected by a US sociopolitical climate steeped in xenophobia, anti-globalist rhetoric, and nationalism. And so there are all of these like interactions at play. And Black international students and immigrant students may feel uncertain about their role in fighting racial injustice, given that their heritage might not have necessarily stemmed from historical racial marginalization in the US, even as they are impacted by the ramifications of that history. Yet at the same time, many Black international students, Black immigrant students, are also really committing themselves to anti-racist work and the fight against anti-Blackness across the diaspora by mobilizing through community activism and in other ways. So just in thinking forward, I always say that white supremacist systems seek to divide Black peoples and has for hundreds of years only to the benefit of white supremacy. So I do think it's important to continue thinking about what Black rising and unity can mean. And we should work within the construct that all Black lives matter. Still, I don't think we should use a one-size-fits-all approach to understanding on our campuses, in particular Black students or faculty or staff. And I don't think we should assume community amongst all Black peoples on our campuses as well. It's important to acknowledge that there may be tensions amongst Black individuals on our campuses that can and should be addressed. And that we should also celebrate the unity and solidarity that we see amongst our diverse Black students, faculty, and staff, who I think demonstrate even more connection to a larger diaspora, given that, again, access to information that I mentioned earlier, showing white supremacy and violence against Black bodies being a truly global phenomenon. So, moving forward, I hope that the dialogue continues around Black heterogeneity and acknowledgement of intergroup diversity. And, let me be clear, I don't think our campuses have enough Black students, period, or faculty or staff when it comes to higher education in the US. Given this reality, Black Americans, in my perspective, should demand that their universities engage in intentional efforts to recruit and retain Black American students. And I believe that Black immigrant and international students should support those demands because the recruitment and retention of Black students shouldn't be an either or. It shouldn't be like, oh, we can only take so many Black Americans and so many Black international students. I'd argue that Black Americans should support greater access opportunities for Black international students because these students typically only comprise a minuscule proportion of the overall percentage of international students on any college campus. So again, it doesn't have to be this like zero-sum game in universities. Reify white supremacist structure by engaging Black bodies on campuses in that way. And so there's this notion of the need to really think about, reflect on, acknowledge, and engage these issues, I think for Black communities on campus, but within the larger higher education structures as well. So that's all I have to say on this, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you very much for these very important opening remarks. And just as a reminder to everybody, this is just the beginning of the conversation. And I really think Dr. George Mwangi has presented several very important lines that we can follow upon. And I invite you to write your questions in response to these. So next, we are going to have Motun similarly providing some opening remarks.
Yes, thank you, Gerardo, for the wonderful introduction, and thank you, Crystal, for providing such great context. And before I start, just wanting to say how excited I am to be invited to speak today and join respected scholars in the field to talk about this really important topic. And I thought I'd start, right by jumping right into my research for my master's thesis. I really looked at Black students abroad. I looked at their experiences of racism and how that impacts their well-being abroad. And today, I really want to focus on only one result in my data, which I think was most relevant to this topic. And that is that for many of my participants, that one of the main kind of sources of racism that they reported experiencing while abroad was from their white peers and their non-Black peers abroad. And, you know, things like stereotyping, slurs, gaslighting, microaggressions, a lot of the things that Crystal alluded to, you know, in regards to the experience of Black international students here. These were the experiences that the Black students were having with their white and non-Black peers abroad, and all sorts of other kind of bad behavior. And in fact, one of the participants shared that she felt that the non-Black students and the white students felt almost liberated abroad, right, to lean into racism that maybe, you know, they couldn't express when they were at home, and really push the envelope in terms of their behavior and their actions and their language abroad. And, you know, this data is not new. There are very few studies that actually look at the experiences of Black students abroad, but you know, within them, I found that this was not, you know, rare, that a lot of Black students were reporting experiencing difficulty with their white students, and this was often not separate from actually the racism that they were experiencing from locals. So they had it in really almost two distinct experiences, one with their American peers and their peers maybe from you know, Western countries that were studying with them, and then their experience with the locals. So experiencing it from kind of all sides while abroad. And there were two things that you know, definitely stood out to me here as important, especially to this topic of Black Lives Matter in the global context and social justice in the global context. And one is, you know, the very obvious issue that Black students aren't having the same experiences abroad as their white peers, that they are experiencing difficulty, that, you know, and the impact of that can be really harmful. And to the extreme, you know, I saw one participant in my study really suffer psychologically from the racism that she was experiencing abroad. And I think that's something that needs to be discussed. That aspect of well-being is important and needs to be looked at in regards to the racism that Black students are facing abroad. But you know, on a larger scale, I think it says a lot about study abroad in general and what it does and doesn't accomplish, especially in regards to the, you know, prevailing language about study abroad and the rhetoric around study abroad. Um, you know, it's not rare. You go on a study abroad website, you see language that says study abroad is transformational, that, you know, it allows students to develop respect for different people and different cultures, and learn tolerance and understanding. And for me, it was hard to reconcile, right, what I was seeing, what the Black students in my study were saying with this language or this rhetoric. So if Black students are saying they don't feel safe with their peers, they don't feel like they belong with their peers, how can we conclude that study abroad, which is, you know, participation is 70% white, how can we say that study abroad helps students develop these competencies, develop tolerance and understanding, when we're saying it's not something they're, you know, showing that they have with their peers abroad. And I think at the foundation of this tension, right, is this assumption that changes are automatic in students, and this is not new in the field as well. A lot of scholars have talked about it, right, that just by going abroad itself, and just by consuming the food, the language, meeting with other people, experiencing the culture, right, that the consumption almost automatically equates to students meaningfully engaging with the culture and with the people, and learning tolerance and understanding. And I think it's necessary to separate those ideas, that consumption automatically equals, you know, that meaningful engagement. And, you know, when in fact there are actually lots of structures in place, I think, in study abroad that do a good job of preventing that meaningful engagement. And, you know, Americans are, likely to live and study and hang out with other Americans and other people from Western countries when they study abroad. They have separate housing that's separated from the local students. Thinking about higher education in general and how elite it is for most of the world, they're likely studying with some of the most privileged people in the host country. They're likely to speak English when they're studying abroad, and even in countries that the native language isn't English, they don't have to struggle in that way. So, the outcome is that study abroad experiences, despite being in another country, I don't think that they look that different from their experiences of home, and that prevents students from really developing these competencies that we want them to. And I think the outcome of this is what we see with Black students and their experiences abroad, right? It affects them in real time while they are in these countries, and not just Black students, but all vulnerable students, right? Um, and I think, of course, the other part of that is that um, students engaging with the local culture and the host community in a way that might not be respectful, especially when those communities don't have the same um, customs, and they don't look exactly like their communities at home, especially if they're in communities where there are a lot of vulnerable people as well. So I think that is an outcome that we see because of the way study abroad is currently structured. And just to conclude, I would say I do think that there is, great opportunity for study abroad to live up to that rhetoric. And a lot of students in the research and in my research felt like study abroad creates this, third space for them to think differently and do differently. And that's where I really think the opportunity lies, but only if study abroad is done more intentionally. And in my article that I wrote for the latest copy of International Higher Education, Nicole Barone and we talk about certain things that study abroad should consider doing to create these meaningful learning opportunities for students. And I think one of those things first is diversifying study abroad even more, right? Crystal talked a little bit about the need for more Black students on campus, and in the same vein, there's a need for more Black students, more underrepresented students in study abroad. But beyond that, I think there's also a need for more diversified administration and study abroad, so that they can really serve the students well in being able to in being able to help them along the way and to really counsel them along their experiences, people that understand what these students are likely to go through. More resources in general to help Black students and other underrepresented students go abroad. And I'm talking about, again, students of color, sexual minorities, students with disabilities. They really need the resources and the support more than the general population of students that we see now studying abroad. The need to break the study abroad bubble, right? I talked a little bit earlier about the fact that American students are very unlikely to engage meaningfully with the local community, and I think we need to break that bubble of them only living and engaging with students that look like them when they're abroad. And I think just finally that students need to be engaging in discussions about their power and social position at home and abroad. And that needs to happen kind of before they go, and also needs to happen while they're there, right? That in engaging with these discussions in real time helps them develop their understanding of where they stand, how their actions affect the spaces that they live and study. And I understand that these are not really small changes, these are big changes that need to happen in the field of study abroad. But I think, for the topic of social justice, of recognizing that Black lives matter, and not just Black lives, but other vulnerable populations matter, and study abroad can really be an area where we can help students develop um, the language and the ability to understand where they can be of service in this area. And that's where I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Motun, for these thoughts. It's really wonderful to get both of your perspectives combined. I think we have certainly multiple perspectives on this phenomena. I would invite perhaps, well, first of all, I will invite all of our members of the audience to type your questions if you have any at the moment. I wanted to return to a few of the things that we have discussed so far in these opening remarks. And I think one of them that warrants some unpacking and some discussion is, I really want to draw a difference here between updating the language and really bringing about meaningful change, right? In generally speaking, international education, whether that is education abroad, whether that is supporting international students and scholars, and also how we think about recruitment and other international partnerships. Because it may feel at times that what we are observing is just a change in language. So just to give you an example, a few decades ago, the movement was about multiculturalism, and there were many multicultural centers being developed. And then there have been different waves. So I kind of give that as background. So kind of paraphrasing a bit what both of you have been advocating for today is that it's not sufficient. We're not just replacing diversity and inclusion with social justice. We're not just replacing racism with anti-Blackness. We're not just doing that. We're really rethinking. And what I would like to ask specifically is, it seems like we are grappling with the role that white supremacy has had in shaping both our professional and academic fields. So I wonder if you would agree, or perhaps if you have a different perspective on this, but that just seems to be at the core of this discussion. And it seems to be, in general, a discussion that many of us sometimes kind of shy away from. So I would just invite both of your reactions to these ideas.
I'm happy to share a little bit first, or either way, but I definitely understand where you're coming from with the idea, the notion of language, one being so critical, but also being kind of watered down around certain issues too. I think that also happens on our campuses. So now, the languages around anti-racism and anti-Blackness on our campuses, so much. I mean, I've just never seen in the US. So, so many campuses talking about and using that terminology. And yet I always do kind of question and wonder, like, well, what does this mean in practice? And how is it coming through in practice? And like you said, is this just a proxy for social justice? That was a proxy for diversity. That was a proxy for, these other kinds of constructs. And so, I really encourage, particularly, well, campuses in general, but I think particularly when we think about international education and offices on campus that support internationalization, is really thinking about what these kinds of concepts and constructs mean within the context of the work that is being done, and really kind of taking stock around the fact that moving towards the kind of work that we're saying needs to happen actually takes, in many ways, transformation, not just a relabeling, or thinking that it's, just going to be kind of some shuffling around of things in small ways. So, the language thing is definitely a piece, but there are scholars, critical scholars, who have warned us about this, have warned us about the watering down, scholars who developed critical race theory that said, eventually this is going to be terminology. We don't want it to be terminology that everyone's just throwing around. We don't want the term intersectionality just being thrown around, but it then becomes these things. So how can we really center power and oppression and privilege and marginalization, these key pieces into the work that we're doing? And it's not easy.
Yeah, I would just add to that by saying that for me, the energy around anti-racism in higher education and in international higher education, for me, I've been thinking that it somewhat feels like a moment, and I would hate for it to be, just a moment that people are focusing on this topic, and once the fire has died down, as I feel that it already has in for many people, that we no longer focus on this topic as much. And I do think, to your point, Gerardo, about grappling with the role white supremacy has played in these systems. And often I've been thinking about the things that we inherit that are simply just the way things are, right? And the work that it takes to unlearn and undo that, and not just in the things that we hold dear to us, right? The things that we have held in, with us as important and critical, and how difficult it makes it to imagine doing things differently. And I've also been thinking about generally just the language we have around the terms and anti-racism, and I worry that there isn't enough looking back into history. Crystal mentioned, a lot of critical scholars that have done this work and have talked about watering down, but also, the terms that drive kind of the action, right? Because I think the language also drives a lot of the action, and wanting people to understand these terms, and wanting people to really know the scholarship that has been behind it, and the politics really that has driven like the development of language as well, before engaging in the work of transformation.
Mhm. Thank you. And I think these are very important ideas, right? So I appreciate you kind of entertaining, both of you entertaining my question. I think another thought that this discussion is really prompting for me, just thinking of our audience, and I recognized a few of the names, but I'm assuming, right, that we have a good balance here of practitioners who may be curious about what can we do, right? And I know, Crystal, in your role as a Chancellor's Fellow, you're working very closely in collaboration with colleagues in the International Programs Office. So are there any practices that perhaps you're identifying that hold some promise, whether at UMass Amherst, or perhaps that you're identifying in other institutions that you think have potential for the field, right? Like, are there things that we are not trying enough yet? That would be interesting. For instance, to me, one of those possibilities when it comes to education abroad, some institutions have had sort of like small offerings specifically for students of color that perhaps that have some diaspora studies connected to them. That's just one idea, right? But there could be others. There could be other manifestations. And I would invite both of you, but Crystal, perhaps with you first, since I was directing first, and certainly I would love to hear from Motun as well.
Sure. I mean, I think the question makes me think of two things. So I think that one is the notion of like programs and practices that can happen to kind of get at and address some of what you're saying. But I think the other part of it is taking stock as a staff of where the staff is around some of these issues as well. And that's one of the things through my fellowship that, we've been doing. So recently had the IPO staff fill out a survey in terms of their reflections of like, what does equity mean to you? And what does it mean in the context of the work that you do? And in what ways do you feel supported around being able to enact practices and programming that support inclusion? In what ways what might you need resources or development around those things? And really being able to kind of think about the people who are engaging in the work and what support, resources, knowledge that they might need. And then also thinking about hiring practices into these offices as well. Matun alluded to this, but in so many international education-based offices, we don't always see multiple kinds of forms of diversity in ways that we might see in other kinds of offices on a college campus. And so, are we, hiring people that have a perspective around and experience and work around things like anti-racism or diversity and inclusion or, however you want to frame it? And how are we also kind of growing our own in a way on our university campuses for students who are really interested in these topics, who are wanting to go abroad or who are international students who are invested in these issues or who are in international education-based academic programs? How are we training and developing them around these issues so that they can have the tools as they go out into the workplace and seek out positions that might be aligned with this work or might be different, but would still be useful? So I think about that in a longer range kind of staff development and student development way. But then again, I also think about it in terms of programs and practices, like you mentioned. So, thinking about heritage education abroad based programs for students of color, ensuring that for international students, all of the support and that they receive is not necessarily housed within just one office, but is in collaborations with other offices that will help to support their multiple identities, and thinking through that as well. And ensuring that the staff within an international student services office are also aware and engaging in collaborations, but it has to be a bi-directional thing. And so establishing those relationships and structures within offices on campus for them to be able to interact easily or more easily. So I think that that's another key piece to think about. So there are lots of different practical kinds of ways to engage the work. And I think models of schools out there doing it, but I think it's like a multi-level, multi-dimensional issue.
Yeah, thank you so much for acknowledging that complexity. Obviously, there are no silver bullets, right? These are issues that have been around higher education institutions from their inception. So obviously, these are complex challenges, and so certainly appreciating the complexity and the difficulty of this process it's a very important place to start. So thank you. Mutun, is there anything you would like to add to this piece?
Yes, just briefly, I'm thinking about like I often feel that like in study abroad, the general feeling is that the work is done once students go abroad. And I think that is a real barrier to the opportunity there. As I mentioned, I think there's an opportunity for having students reflect in their position in the world, at home and abroad, and engaging with students while they're there to think about it, and when they return as well. There's a lot of research that thinks about like using students as an opportunity to learn for students in the home campus as well. And I think ramping up how we engage with students while they're there and when they return is a real opportunity to further learning and to open up different areas of learning.
Thank you. So our next question is coming from our colleague Rebecca Schendel in the here in CIHE, and of course there is no question that living outside of a study abroad bubble is very helpful and important, right? And certainly pushing students to engage with difference. But I guess the sort of the next piece is really about the contrast between internationalization and interculturalization, right? So meaning the following, right? Like internationalization often focuses only with engaging with difference in terms of other countries, for example. Whereas interculturalization, right, is a domestic agenda in most countries, as well as an international one, right? So it's more complex in that sense. So Mutun, perhaps you can get us started, and I would also invite Crystal's thoughts on this. Do you both see then study abroad sojourns as a potential and useful third space where maybe students can grapple with power differentials within their home countries, as well as learning about their host culture? Or do you see this as an important prerequisite to study abroad in the first place? So here, in a way, we have a question really that is complex but really important. So we look forward to both your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Rebecca. And yeah, this was something that I thought a lot about in my study as well. And, you know, a lot of students do feel that, you know, study abroad is kind of a break from their usual. And that's where I really see the opportunity. But as you mentioned, there is, and that it speaks to the whole process of like internationalization at home, and the idea that when you think about it, only a very small percentage of students get to study abroad in the US. So that means you have a lot of students who are missing out on this kind of engagement, on this opportunity for learning. I do see that, I do think that it is, I don't think that, I think that, you know, there should be a space for developing, you know, um, kind of an understanding of power differences before you go abroad, but I don't think that that's where it really stops, right? So I think there's an area for the preparation, and well, that's one thing I found in my study, actually, that the students weren't prepared well for the students. And of course, I was talking to Black students, so they were talking about the, they weren't prepared for the racism that they would experience abroad. But I think it also speaks to the fact that they didn't hear a lot of talk about racism. Like people, like the study abroad administrators didn't mention it very much, and feeling like they had to chase after that information from others that look like them, or, you know, knowing that that wasn't something that the institution was going to provide for them. So I definitely think that there's space to do more of that in preparation. I think there is also that third space is important because it you know, creates I think a distance from home, and the systems of home and the rhythms of home, that helps to put students in a different kind of learning space, that helps to you know, help them, you know, engage with this topic on a level that I don't think they may be able to at home.
I can share I think briefly that I agree with Motun in that the idea of student learning development is a process. And so, you know, I don't necessarily think that there's an expectation that all students are at like this very certain specific point to be able to engage in education abroad. But at the same time, I do agree that there is a need for targeted pre-departure kind of work. And as Motun says, you know, our campuses are internationalized and global, just even outside of just working within partnerships and collaborations abroad. I mean, many are housed in areas that have local immigrant communities, or have all of these other pieces that we talk about regarding internationalization at home. So again, how are students being able to kind of think about, reflect on, and do that work prior to going abroad? And what are the learning outcomes? Like, can there be, pre-departure kind of learning outcomes to ensure students are exposed to things, reflecting on things before, and then, these learning outcomes that happen throughout? I think if we, are centered on those things, then the process becomes a process. Right now, I'm teaching a class where students, it's a different context, but we're talking about becoming anti-racist scholars, and that being a journey. And so, there's not some like endpoint where you're just an perfect anti-racist person, right? But it's all of this learning and unlearning and relearning that has to be very intentional and continue happening. And I think about how that can be embedded in the process for students in engaging their experiences abroad before, during, and after.
Great. Thank you both. And definitely this seems to be an area of more that has initiated a lot of sharing and thoughts. Just a very quick comment from our colleague Nick Gozik here at Boston College, who is pointing out how BC does have a course called Reflections at Being Abroad, which seems to be sharing some of these goals and outcomes, right, that we are discussing. Certainly, there might be many other interventions to perhaps continue developing. And I think both of you have pointed out to the importance of both preparation ahead, but also the opportunity to reflect, right, and to unpack. So in a way, how do we integrate these experiences throughout the whole experience of an undergraduate, and let's be radical here, even graduate education, because I think there are some possibilities as well to make these opportunities available to graduate students, who some of them have had experiences for study abroad, but many of them haven't. And I think that's an important conversation as well. We have our next question is coming from Abigail Smith. And it's an interesting question because I think it intersects identities with a regional focus. So the question is, when I look at the opportunities for international education, it seems like the Caribbean is a region of untapped partnerships within US higher education, given the proximity to the US and lack of English language barriers in many of the Afro-Caribbean countries. From your perspective, how come we still have these sort of like untapped potential, right? What may be getting in the way? So we have proximity, we don't have a very significant, in most cases, time difference. In English is, generally speaking, a good possibility. So what are some of the obstacles that that may remain? Would either of you kind of venture to share some ideas?
I never know whether to start or not. So, yeah, that's a very specific question. And I think that there's likely a number of reasons, but I also sometimes question these things. I think about the diaspora more broadly too. So I think about why, so this doesn't answer your question, but I think about Africa as well. Like there's lots of study abroad opportunities to like Cape Town, South Africa, which is a very, very specific part of South Africa and a very specific part of Africa as well. So it's just, so I oftentimes think about what is it in part, I think it's lots of different things. I think it's one aspect of it are the companies that are, we're working with that kind of help facilitate these education abroad opportunities. Are they, emphasizing and focusing in on particular regions or not? I think about how our student interests kind of developed around some of these different regions. So for example, I think for US students, how often are they learning about the Caribbean in their K-12 education to then think beyond going on vacation, like I would want to go and engage in work in that region. I think that oftentimes, and I am a product of the US education system, when I, think of, I remember, educate social studies curriculum, it wasn't focused there, it was focused predominantly in Europe. And so, those are the things that I was more familiar with in terms of thinking about academic work to be done somewhere, in education abroad. So I think about that and how that then may impact students' interests. I think about the students who think about going abroad. Again, as Mutun talked about, there are fewer students who might, fewer Black students going abroad who, again, need to kind of be recruited in and tapped in, and having, the Caribbean be a region of focus or emphasis might, attract more students of color to want to engage in education abroad. But I think that universities also need to be thinking about, like, what are the regions, and this is some of the work we're doing with IPO, what are the regions in which faculty are engaged in research and collaborations, right? Because sometimes that drives the ability to engage in abroad opportunities. Where are the gaps? What does our social network kind of look like in terms of where our campus is connected? Why might that be happening? Sometimes doing some of that assessment and evaluation will actually help to answer the question in a very contextual way for your campus. That's just some things.
Thank you, Crystal. Mutun, would you like to add to this?
Yes, I would agree with a lot of what Crystal is saying, and thinking about the population of students that study abroad. Again, I mentioned that over so about 70% of students who study abroad are white, and when you look at the numbers for where they study abroad, it's overwhelmingly in Europe, it's overwhelmingly in Australia, and a part of that, I think, is the options that they have. I was talking to a student, and she said her university, her program that was in South Africa. After she finished her program, it was one of, her university cut programs in Africa. It just wasn't, the ones that they were promoting. So I think a lot of it has to do with like what the institution is making available for students, what they're seeing as an attractive place to go. And I think that really starts, with the institution. And when you're thinking about the commercialization and marketization of study abroad, the countries that benefit are also mostly in Europe and Australia and things like that. So I think there's a lot of work to be done at the institution of promoting these programs, of seeing them as a way for students to learn and engage with difference in a really unique place where they would be forced, right, as opposed to a Europe or Australia, to engage meaningfully with the local community, that a community that may not look like them.
Thank you very much. And of course, we are pushing toward the time for the conclusion, but I think we do have time for one more question, and we have one that I think is very, very intriguing, perhaps in an effort to start, kind of putting together a few closing thoughts. Where do you see, right, like, where do you see the main problems with racial issues in higher education to be? Maybe I'll rephrase this as, what should we be paying attention to going forward? Some of them, for example, are paying at, some of our colleagues are pointing out to admissions, others to assessments, others to financial support, legal restrictions. Of course, the issues are very complex. In your perspective, what should we be paying attention to? And I will add to that, to this question, as we are beginning, right, to perhaps think that while we are still in the middle of a crisis, it's within reason to think that maybe in a year time or around, sometimes travel will begin resuming, and perhaps we'll be called upon restarting some of these international activities face to face. Or maybe the ideas that you are proposing to pay attention to can still be pursued at a distance. So in other words, I invite you to forecast for us a little bit of the future in terms of race relations and international higher education. Mutun, why don't you get us started this time?
Sure. I would say that I think for me, doing my research was just a really, it was the first time I'd done something like that, and the act of like listening to what people have had these experiences have to say, and I think learning from students really has to take the priority in learning from vulnerable students and underrepresented students, the students that we're seeking to engage in international education experiences, I think has to be primary, and really letting that kind of lead in terms of how we approach transformation in the field. I think that, of course, we talked a little bit about the work that needs to be done, inside study abroad offices and inside the administration. And I think that is an important piece as well, that the grappling with the things that have been inherited that we haven't questioned, and of course that also I believe will lead to change in how things have always been done.
Thank you very much, Mutun. Crystal.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just wrap up with saying, from my worldview, racism is embedded in all that we do and see in the United States. But and while that is so problematic on so many levels, it requires us to do the work of engaging and resisting, like I said earlier, learning and unlearning. And I think that there's no greater opportunity than right in this moment. I think COVID-19 has taught us so many things about what is possible, even though in some ways it's forced higher. It seems like it's forced and higher has been dragged across trying to figure out what is possible. But so I think about, accessibility has been thought about differently now in the space that we have to be in. And I think things like the Black Lives Matter movement and all the police brutality that we see in the US and around the world is also being centered and allowing us to think about how is the work that we're doing, how can it be connected to these things? I think that the call for anti-racism in our work and practice is something that we can and should be leaning into and provides opportunities. So while I think that the question around like, okay, well, where is racism the most problematic? I think it's just problematic. It's embedded, but that there are all of these opportunities, and that international education and internationalization on their own are not they're not going to resist anti-blackness and racism, but it's through the work of people involved in those spaces and in those offices, thinking about how processes and practices and structures can be redefined and redesigned, that we are going to see dismantling of those things. So I just would be encouraging to you all to continue thinking about, grappling about, and trying to do that work.
Thank you both. Thank you, Crystal, for this reminder that it's not institutions that do anything. It's really all of us collectively in how we connect with each other, how we work together, how we reflect about our practice that can really lead to transformation. And what a wonderful way to bring our session to an end. It has been really wonderful to have you both. I appreciate you spending time in this discussion, both our panelists and all of our participants. I just want to take a final moment to remind you the chat includes the latest issue of IHE, where both our panelists contributed. I invite you to read their very, very thoughtful contributions and continue engaged with this topic that way. I also want to remind you that tomorrow at 11, we will have another webinar organized by the Center for International Higher Education in the context of International Education Week. The topic for that event is Education and Displacement, Inclusion, Exclusion, and Strategies for Social Justice. There is still time to register, and the link for the registration site is also in the chat. I just want to take a moment to thank Dr. Crystal George Mwangi and Motun Bolumole for joining us today, for sparking such a wonderful conversation and sharing your research and your reflections with us. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.